I've written a couple of stories, some of them quite just sort of mischievous,
Yeah.
about Nokia and Ericsson. They seem to be increasingly briefing against each other.
Yeah. Well, it's good fun.
Yeah, it is. It's great
Right.
fun. In fact, I think at the bottom of one of my pieces, I encouraged them. I said, if they want to slag each other off, please feel free to do it on Telecoms.com.
Yeah. Maybe when I do write it up, all it will be is an opportunity to put some clickbaity headline up.
Well, someone will get bent out of shape about it, but you're used to that, aren't you?
Yeah.
That's what we do. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. I'm joined by the core crew of Ian and Jamie. Ian, you're looking very smart.
Thank you very much.
Jamie, yeah, you're looking fine, mate.
Been in important meetings.
Well, exactly. Well, you always have important meetings. What are they like? I've never had one. Anyway,
I'll let you know when it happens.
Okay, cool. And just as a reminder that if you're watching this on YouTube or on Facebook or on the site, you can listen to it on iTunes or SoundCloud or loads of other platforms. And one other very brief reminder that we are receiving entries for the Global Telecoms Awards that are very good, and you should enter if you haven't already. That's all. Okay, what we're going to talk about this week. We're going to start off. I was noticing, because I write the sort of headline and the blurb for the pod, and every week we either start off with Huawei or we start off with 5G, and I'm afraid 5G is going to have to be that again. But it is a telecom. Each time I apologise for it, I get all defensive and go, it's Telecoms podcast, what do you expect?
Yeah.
And 5G definitely qualifies there. But we're going to take a slightly different angle. The last couple of weeks we spoke about the launch of 5G in the UK. Now we're going to take a more sort of global look. Jamie's written a piece, sort of a snapshot of how things are progressing, and you've been looking into some market shares and that sort of thing. So we'll start off by talking about that. Then we're going to talk a bit about regulation of big tech, not so much telecoms companies, but big tech companies, especially US ones, because there's been some developments there. And we're going to conclude with a look at the telecoms environment from a sort of headcount consolidation jobs perspective. So the 5G thing. So I'm going to start by handing it off to you, Jamie. You wrote a piece, a pretty long, exhaustive piece, looking at how things have progressed 5G-wise so far. So over to you.
Yeah. I mean, it was just supposed to be more of a wrap-up of what's going on at the moment, and it kind of. I mean, I didn't realise how quickly some other regions around the world are progressing.
Right.
Which is, something that telco journalists should never really admit to. But we primarily.
I admit to my own incompetence all the time.
We primarily focus on the major markets which are of a concern to us.
Yeah.
So predominantly around Europe, North America, mainly the US, and some of the big markets in Asia. So we're looking at probably Japan, China, and South Korea there predominantly. But it is. I mean, it is quite remarkable when you look around the world at how many companies and countries are getting there or have actually switched on.
Right.
Everyone talks about South Korea and the US and China taking this, this rapid lead in the 5G world. But then you look at, certain places in the Middle East where they've already launched 5G, like in, I think it's Qatar and Kuwait. The Saudis are sending a load of mixed messages, and the UAE is planning to launch in the next couple of months as well. And then even when you go into sort of Africa, there's some sort of 5G timelines which are targeting the end of 2019 in South Africa. Nigeria's targeting 2020.
Okay.
Kenya, I couldn't really get a good handle on it.
Carry on.
Couldn't really get a good handle on it. And then even when you go down to sort of South America, well, at least it's not going to the toilet. So, and then even South America, they're targeting sort of late 2019 and early 2020. So it is. Although we focus on Europe and certain markets in Europe and North America and Asia, it was just a bit of a reminder, and a nice little reminder every now and then, that the rest of the world really isn't that far behind. We talk about these leading nations like they're light years ahead, but realistically you're talking about anywhere between 6 months to 12 months for the fast followers, and some of these are countries and telcos that you really wouldn't expect to put them in the chasing pack. And then you're looking at the latter end for 2020, 2021 for a lot of other countries as well.
So obviously this needs to be slightly qualified when we say talk about launching 5G in terms of coverage, and it's kind of a two-tier thing, isn't it? We're having the first dipping a toe in the water with the sort of non-standalone type
in the
of stuff.
UAE, the royal family can use it at the moment, but nobody else.
Is that it?
Yeah, because it's only the palace that has coverage.
And they can just stream
like that.
4K video as much as they want.
Yeah, but UAE is one of the ones who hasn't. They haven't claimed
no, I'm
they've
just
switched
joking.
it on.
Oh,
yet.
okay.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
I'm just mucking around.
So that's my point. My point's slightly sort of pedantic, but in so much as you can claim the switching on of 5G, but it'll be a first incremental step.
Yeah.
And it's
Well, I
interesting.
think in Finland, weren't they claiming to have switched it on last year?
Yeah, I
They
mean,
said they
right.
had the world's first commercial network.
So
at
are
least,
Verizon and AT&T.
Yeah.
I mean, let's not forget, like
Sorry.
midway through 2018, they turned on 5G in North America, but it was these data pods,
Yeah.
hotspots
Yeah.
that you hooked your phone up to, and fixed wireless access.
Yeah.
propositions.
Yeah, I mean, do we
and
count?
is it really 5G? I mean, Verizon stuff's has been pre-standard for a while. I think,
And do we
so-
count fixed wireless access as switching on 5G?
Yeah, and it's pre-standard in Verizon's case anyway, so it's not
Anyway,
even. Yeah.
but it's fine. I mean, I stress it's a pedantic point, and your underlying point sound.
Well, it is, but you're not going to get. It sounds pedantic, but standards are standard for a reason. Because you get the global economy.
This is not like AT&T with its what's it?
I think that's. I
5G
don't think that's
evolution.
much worse, really. I don't think it's much worse.
No,
than
it
that.
was AT&T. You just keep doing the
You
filming,
know,
sweet cheeks.
One of them's touting something that isn't really 5G is 5G. It's a pre-standard version of it,
AT&T.
although it can be migrated. Well, and then you've got AT&T doing this 5G evolution malarkey, which is basically 4G evolution.
I mean, I think
So-
the important thing is yes and no. It's not 5G as we envisage it, and it's not the full blown promise. But even if you're not getting the massive speeds, you're only getting, let's say, 100 to 200 megabits per second, which is still astronomical. It does give the opportunity for the app developers to get their hands on these speeds and create applications that are fit for this sort of technology evolution, because ultimately it's a solution without a problem at the moment. It's like there aren't any apps that require this much this sort of like this horsepower.
Quite.
There's so much data overheads when you look at all the applications we're using at the moment. But as soon as the app developers get their hands on even 100 to 200 megabits per second, they will make something which can make use of 100 to 200 megabits
Well, that's
per
something
second.
I was just speculating. Just this afternoon I was writing about the sort of proper launch of this Google Stadia platform, which is cloud gaming, which basically requires no local sort of gaming
content,
hardware
yeah.
or storage of software, but does require, like for the super duper version, about 35 megabits per second connection, and even for normal HD gaming about 20 megabits per second, which is fine. A lot of broadband connections are fine with that. I actually just tested mine at home. Mine's at about 35.
I think the trouble is if you've got people watching TV, haven't you, at the same time? There's
Yeah.
several streams in the house, so
If
you
you've
kind of
got-
need a fibre to the home
And-
connection.
And the other thing I was going to say is, with 5G and with mobile, right now, I can't see why I would want to just play a regular sort of kind of game that people play on the PlayStation on my phone at 4K. But as Jamie says, in that sort of build it and they'll come sort of way, if once that bandwidth is available, I'd expect developers to come up with some quite groovy ones that pick up on mobile stuff like location-based and augmented reality and all that sort of thing, and then it could be a
Yeah.
killer app for 5G.
Although I think it's the next sort of wave of 5G that's probably going to really make the difference.
Right, because you've got to have the low latency
Yeah,
and that
because
sort of thing.
I'm not convinced that. I mean, the very sort of fastest mobile networks now, 4G advanced stuff, and the technologies that you can bring into that will provide huge amounts of bandwidth if operators are prepared to make those investments.
But you've got to compare it with the size of the pipe as well, if that makes sense. Because 4G you can get a very fast flowing pipe, but 5G combines a fast flowing pipe with a super wide capacity, so you get more data throughput. And sort of like when we were having a pint the other day in Central, and where were we, down by the city?
Yeah.
And you couldn't get on your 4G network because there was so much sort of
you
congestion.
were so drunk.
In the,
You might get
Yeah,
more
it
buttons
frees.
to press.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, you get additional capacity because you're
Yes.
getting new spectrum. But I still think that the real sort of potentially the real game-changing stuff's going to come when they start to move to a later sort of version of 5G, where we keep talking about it, where you get sort of low latency coming into the picture, and That's what everybody's getting excited about, is whether that sort of stuff is going to really make a difference and give rise to new services, and that's still 2 or 3 years away.
I mean, the other thing that I've said this numerous times before, and it is quite repetitive, but it's the same thing that happened with 4G. Uber didn't exist prior to 4G networks not only existing but being mainstream or in the sort of society, and that idea will eventually emerge in 5G. But at the moment, we're still saying, I wasn't writing on telco when 4G emerged, but I'm pretty sure exactly the same conversation would have been had then. Why do we actually need this much speed?
Well, this is the vendor's line. This is what Aaron Bansell at Ericsson, he's like their European boss, was talking about this just now.
And which is why you're dressed so smart.
Which is why I'm dressed like that. He said.
I still would have worn a metal T-shirt to interview.
I know you would. But
That's why I'm not interviewing him.
He was saying because they were always grumbling, Ericsson, about Europe's sort of lagging in development, and the big issue is spectrum. It's not being released quickly enough.
Whenever
it's all too expensive.
talks about that a lot.
It's like one of their little hobby horses. But he said today, unless he said there's a risk that Europe doesn't get, like Jamie says, it doesn't get the kind of companies developing applications for these types of service if the networks aren't there, and if the capabilities aren't there. It's chicken and egg. There's no kind of big tech giants in Europe, and one of the reasons, not the total reason, he said one of the reasons for that is networks not being built quickly enough.
Well, I completely agree with that sort of like rhetoric as well. Like, there's a reason the US led the 4G sort of like revolution. Well, not led it, but capitalised the greatest on it, and it's because they had the network. Because if you have a network in a test lab, great, you can invite really smart people in to create these POCs. If you have it scaled to a city, all of a sudden you've got a living test lab where you can test it on new people. If you've got it scaled to an entire country, that's when you can scale a product and it becomes a real product that you can potentially launch onto the international markets and then hoover up the profits. And this is exactly what 4G did in Silicon Valley for the likes of, look at these, not so much, Facebook from a mobile perspective, but then you look at the companies like Airbnb, Uber, Lyft, these companies that
I think
didn't
Uber's
exist.
the main one.
Yeah.
Because you don't really need it for Airbnb, but Uber you really do need it.
No, but 4G took mobile to everywhere and every device, didn't it? And
it did,
Airbnb, arguably wouldn't have been as successful.
No, it wouldn't. But you can sort of sit in your house and.
It's not entirely
I don't think it's. I think it's a reason, definitely. I think there's obviously other reasons why Europe doesn't have tech giants. They're not just to do with networks, but. That's a different argument from telecom. But,
I think it's the scale of the market as well.
Scale of the market, regulation.
This is something they said yesterday. You look at the US, and I'm not violating any off the record comments here. But you look at the scale of the US. It's massive. It's a huge economy
China.
With a huge amount of people that all speak the same language. That the opportunity to scale a product there is immense. Whereas across Europe, you've got even in the EU, you've got 28 different jurisdictions, 28 different types of law, probably 20 different languages you've got to take into consideration. It's it makes it much more difficult to scale products in Europe.
One other question I got, based on sort of back to what you were talking about at the start, Jamie. In fact, Ian, you could confirm this, as you're the only one out of three of us who was actively writing about this sector when 4G came about. My hunch is that some of these developing countries that Jamie was a bit pleasantly surprised to see are getting their act together took a bit longer the last time around. Is that correct? Was there a bit more of a delay?
Africa, that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they're still not.
It's still not fixed.
4G is still not very widely deployed in a lot of African markets now. And
so why do we think that they're getting their act together more quickly, if indeed this is the case with 5G?
I'm not sure they are.
Okay.
No, but
they might want to. But
this is part of the reason why I was quite surprised when you look at someone like Colombia has the intention of launching 5G, and I'm not going to say it's going to be nationwide 5G, but I was quite pleasantly surprised to see that they were they were targeting early 2020. Because they haven't fixed the 4G problem yet. They still haven't got 4G everywhere to the same scale that we have.
It's like the Turkish Prime Minister says, isn't it? We should just skip 5G and just go to 6G.
Right.
Forget about all that nonsense.
Well, yeah, there is that. Ian, your chat with your man from Ericsson. Any other juicy morsels from that?
Well, he was in quite an assertive mood
Right.
on how well they're doing in the market. Now all vendors are going to talk up how well they're doing, obviously.
Right,
But
yes.
he was.
We just had, I didn't write it up, but
there's-
we just had Nokia send a press release about how many deal wins they got.
Exactly, which I asked him about. So there's a lot of this going on at the moment. The operators sort of putting little maps up showing
Yeah.
which customers they've won deals with or how many contracts they've won. And Nokia keeps sort of touting quite a lot more, I think, than Ericsson in terms of contracts. 42, I think. Ericsson, it doesn't name them, but
Well, quite.
but
I
he's-
think in
he's-
terms of name, they're one or two ahead, but in terms of
He's very
total claims,
scathing about all of this.
Okay,
I mean,
why?
He said that none of this is actually translating into revenues for them because you can sign a contract, but until the companies actually start to build something out, then you
Right.
don't actually make any money. And he said that Nokia doesn't really have anything commercially in the market at the moment. They have,
Ooh. Nice.
So
Go
look
for
at
it,
all
innit?
the networks that are there that are actually commercially live in. I sort of think in the areas that he deals with, he's the head of Western Europe and Latin America, but also has some kind of involvement in the US. And he's saying that it's all pretty much Ericsson. They've got a massive lead. And I said, do you think you're gaining market share at their expense? And he's like, yes, no doubt about it. Which is they're often a bit cagey.
Is that your
about
headline when you
want.
write it up then? Sounds like it.
I'm going to go and speak to a few analysts and see what they
Right.
think, because you
See
get
if
these
they think
companies
he's
that come
talking-
up with market share projections and they track this
Yeah.
stuff quite closely, but then they're often not willing to sort of say things that in those sorts of terms. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, there have been signs that Nokia's been struggling a little bit.
Well, there's still those
5G.
rumours that they haven't been able to put to bed. That one of the problems with the T-Mobile rollout is that some of their 5G base stations weren't working properly.
Right.
And a lot of people, or not a lot of people, but there's a few people that are saying, well, it's actually Nokia kit that's not
Yeah,
working.
there's talk.
Right.
I mean, they said themselves we have some interoperability and standardisation issues whenever they report earnings at the
Wasn't
moment.
there a Korean thing a little while ago?
Exactly the same thing happened in Korea, where there were reports that they were experiencing interoperability issues,
Right.
and they've said in earnings reports this is one thing that's slowing things down
This
a
is
bit.
a
Now,
thing.
Ericsson doesn't make any mention of that, and I said, haven't you seen the same thing? Because it sounds like something that would affect all vendors.
Yeah.
And he was like, no, we're the only vendor that's completed interoperability testing with every single chip manufacturer that's kind of involved in this business. And so he's pretty.
They're
sort of
definitely really
bold.
going for it. I've written a couple of stories, some of them quite just sort of mischievous,
Yeah.
about Nokia and Ericsson. They seem to be increasingly briefing against each other.
Yeah. Well, it's good fun.
Yeah, it is. It's great
Right.
fun. In fact, I think at the bottom of one of my pieces, I encouraged them. I said,
Yeah.
if they want to slag each other off, please feel
Yeah.
free to do it on Telecoms.com.
Yeah. Maybe when I do write it up, all it will be is an opportunity to put some clickbaity headline up.
Well,
I don't
someone will
know,
get
but,
someone will get bent out of shape about it, but you're used to that, aren't you?
Yeah.
That's what we do. Okay.
Yeah. I
And-
have to see what Nokia has to say about it next week, because I'm supposed to be having a chat with them. So we'll
Okay.
see what they.
So
say
I had a little
about it.
look at because we were chatting about this a little bit before we started recording the pod. I had a little look at their share prices, and over the course of this year, Ericsson's is trending upwards and Nokia's is trending downwards.
Yeah.
And obviously that could be a product of all sorts of things, many of which have got nothing to do with what we're discussing. But it does seem, and sometimes when I get press releases like that Nokia one going, look how well we're doing, you sort of think, well, are you protesting a bit too much then?
Yeah.
So, I don't know anything about how well they're doing, but it's interesting that Ericsson's coming out and saying it. And if you're chatting to Nokia, then, you've got perfect ammo to sort of trigger them.
Exactly,
When
yeah.
you chat to them and go, Ericsson's saying you're rubbish. What you got to say about that?
Yeah.
It could all get a bit tasty. So, yes, okay.
One other thing he did
Yeah.
say actually on the market share front, which was interesting, was that they're not really sort of seeing any kind of boost at the moment from what's happening with Huawei. Our favourite topic.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Which
so
which is slightly counterintuitive,
it is.
isn't it?
Yeah. So everybody's. I mean, a lot of the analysts keep sending notes around saying, pressure on Huawei is going to lead to opportunities for Nokia and
You'd
Ericsson.
think.
I was like, well, are you starting to see something? He said, no, we're not at the moment.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
at the moment, where it is really making an impact are markets that Huawei haven't really operated
North America
that
doesn't count.
extensively in anyway, so there's not going to be that much of a net gain to
Well, so
Ericsson.
Europe
No,
strikes
but-
me as the biggie.
Europe is a biggie. So, I mean, the UK, where BT and Vodafone are both waiting for the supply chain review to come out that the government's written.
Well, that's
writing.
that's the reason that Ericsson and Nokia, because there's all this ambiguity is just slowing down.
It's slowing it down,
actual
For everyone.
expenditure
Yeah.
for anyone. Well, why would you? This is the thing. Like, you wouldn't want to spend on Ericsson. Oh, sorry, you wouldn't want to spend on Huawei just in case that
Yeah.
you have to rip everything out of the network. But then the exact same thing is applicable to Ericsson and Nokia. And you wouldn't want to spend Nokia. You wouldn't want to spend on them
in case you don't have to
in case you don't have to rip everything out. So
Yes,
you could
it's
spend
the old
on Huawei.
uncertainty
And,
problem.
and he's obviously in. They're obviously in talks with. Reading between the lines, he didn't say this, but they're obviously in talks with BT and with Vodafone about this and opportunities. So you could see if things go really against Huawei in the UK market, and the supply chain review comes out and has a much more kind of anti-Huawei conclusion than we've been sort of led to expect that it's going to come up with. Then Ericsson might be shouting about gains at Huawei's expense later in the year.
Okay.
in
Yeah,
the
because
UK
you would expect
market.
it to happen. Jamie makes a point about the markets where Huawei's not much of a presence. Obviously, North America, it's not allowed in
No.
at all.
And never has been.
And then obviously,
They have deals with rural carriers in North
Yeah.
America, and that's changing a bit, isn't it? Because
But
of
then
this-
we've got Latin America. Certainly, historically, the US had a very strong sort of political economic influence on Latin America.
Yeah.
Certainly, any Latin American countries that consider themselves allied, i.e., not Venezuela and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Countries like Chile, you'd expect them to sort of want to
Well,
keep
yeah.
the Americans happy on that one. Chile's a great country. I won't
Argentina-
hear a word said against Chile.
Huawei's lost business in Argentina to Ericsson. I know that.
Right. Okay.
But I mean that happened slightly before this whole discussion kind of gathered momentum last year.
Africa, you still expect Huawei to be
Well, I
doing well,
think
don't you?
Huawei is probably doing its most to try and protect its
Yeah.
African business. It'd be interesting to kind of get a sense of what's going on in Africa, really, because you kind of if things do kind of start to fragment and we get this situation where little fiefdoms develop, where Ericsson and Nokia here and Huawei's kind of in Asia, then you get the
Gets a
thing
bit
that
balkanised.
ZTE and Huawei are going to be looking at Africa thinking we really need to defend our territory here, because if we get squeezed out of there as well.
And
then
Middle
we're
East
kind of
is an
forced
interesting
back
one, because of course there's some countries like Saudi Arabia that are to some extent closely allied to the States,
Yeah.
but they're still doing their own thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, interesting stuff. We should move on. Regulation. So there's a couple of threads to this one. First one, I'm going to chuck the ball back to Jamie, because you wrote a piece. Well, we'd written a couple of pieces, but you wrote the sort of bigger piece on how Google and Amazon especially are likely to come under a lot more regulatory scrutiny in the US. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so there's a House Antitrust subcommittee which is sort of investigating the influence of big tech,
Yeah.
essentially. I mean, just to complete the story, it doesn't actually mean anything at the moment.
Right.
They've got details are relatively thin on the ground as well. It's basically a subcommittee which is going to say what is the position of technology at the moment in the US, and how much of an influence is this having on society,
Right.
the sort of the smaller ecosystems and the sort of the developing
Right, so
community.
competition.
Yeah,
A lot of it's
essentially.
from a competition point of view, isn't it?
A competition perspective. But I mean, for me, it makes perfect sense that they're doing this right now, because this is essentially what America does. I mean, it allows monopolies to exist, and then tackles them
As a
when when the industry has hit a certain sort of threshold. And you can see this from pretty much every industry in the US. If you go back to oil, sugar, tobacco, they even tried it with sort of tech in the 90s as well, when they did some sort of antitrust cases against against Microsoft.
Yeah.
But it's set in. I mean, the best example is oil. So I was having a look into this, and in the early 1900s, so at the beginning of last century, Standard Oil owned or controlled 90% of the
Right.
market, and it was allowed, and there was no price fixing. It was actually being a very fair business.
Fair monopolist.
Yeah, it was being a fair monopolist. But the government attacked this monopoly and spread it out elsewhere as soon as the rail infrastructure had been completed. So all of the vast expense of moving the sort of oil around the country had been swallowed up by Standard Oil. Therefore, the barriers to entry for smaller companies was significantly lower. And you could probably say the same thing about sort of technology nowadays. Technology needed to be normalised in the eyes of the consumer. Ultimately, we got to always remember, tech is still a really, really young industry.
We didn't know how big social media was going to be 20 years ago. It barely even existed 20 years ago.
No, it didn't exist.
No.
Facebook was only founded in 2004, 2005.
And even like Google, the search engines, I mean, I'm old enough, sadly, to remember when Google just started. People were using Yahoo and Alta Vista and all that sort of thing.
And all of these businesses and all of these practices and this sort of way of life had to be normalised in the eyes of the consumer, and doing it through sort of monopolies or duopolies in certain cases is probably the best way to do it, because it offers streamlined operations, more efficient spending, economy of scale. It allows them to scale quicker, and invest faster, and
I would also
reach that moment of normalisation quicker.
I would also argue on top of that it's almost an inevitable consequence of a completely new industry that a first mover who gets a dominant position like Google with search is going to almost inevitably become to some degree a monopolist. The tricky bit is that then they start raising the barriers to entry, and that's when it becomes a competition concern.
I mean, this is where arguably, while they've attacked these monopolies in the past and sort of then divvied up the wealth and, past that watershed moment is probably a couple of years ago for tech. But at least they're trying to get to it now, and they're trying to open up the community and allow these sort of like these sort of micro ecosystems to thrive and spread the wealth around the actual segment itself, instead of being concentrated in places like Google and Facebook and Microsoft. And I think Microsoft is probably in the safest position because they're at least for the moment, a lot of their business model is focused around a sort of a segment which is still developing, cloud computing. So you've got the big players, but it is quite a big market in cloud computing. You've got let's say the top four. You've probably got the top three. Let's say I was going to include IBM in there, but no, I'm not going to anymore. AWS. Microsoft and Google at the top. Then you've got a load of fast followers, and then you've got basically everyone else. So it's still got
Alibaba as well.
Alibaba is sort of like cracking into that, but they're not really nailed the international segment yet.
No, but they're absolutely. Sorry, complete tangent, but I'll be quick. I was looking at some Alibaba numbers. I knew they were huge. I didn't realise that. But in terms of e-commerce, they're much bigger than Amazon. I didn't realise that.
It's a big market, isn't it, China?
In terms of revenues. Anyway, sorry.
But this is where like the other guys. So you could argue that this cloud segment hasn't quite been normalised yet. So they'll allow this sort of like dancing with the devil, continuing this monopoly for the greater good. But something like internet search, are they going to allow that to be Google to be so dominant there? It'd be very difficult to break it up. But e-commerce, are they going to allow Amazon? I mean, you could argue they've hit these threshold moments like Standard Oil did in the 1900s or the early 1900s.
The internet search thing doesn't worry me so much, because I think in a way it makes sense to have the network effects idea that plays a part there, and I think that's almost a natural monopoly in a way, it seems, the sort of search engine business. But the worry for me is that they're able to use the revenues from that to dominate other areas. And it's you worry where do the Googles of the future appear these days, and then
admittedly this pre-install on phones, yes, okay, they're forcing it a bit there, but arguably, and I think the vast majority of people would agree with me, Google is the best search engine out there. So it's
just inertia.
Choice monopoly.
I mean, Bing might be perfectly good. I just don't feel like using it.
I've used it before because we've got Windows as the sort of the default thing on our computers, and it's just not as good. It's just not as good.
So one point I want to make I agree with both of you that it's a natural monopoly, and to a certain extent, if you're going to be, in favour of the free market, which I am, then you can't punish companies for being too successful. That's kind of contradictory. But the problem with the search monopoly isn't search itself; it's the advertising, and this directly affects our industry, media, because actually Google, in terms of its business model, is a media company, and them and Facebook. If you look at the US, they account for an absolutely ridiculous amount of all ad spend. It's just them and Facebook, and so that's where it starts to have a certain sort of plurality, a certain competition, a certain antitrust concern, because then you're driving. And also, this is going to overlap into a tangent I want to go off onto. You're getting into some sort of social considerations. For example, if there's so little money going on in media that either media is dying out or media is forcing itself to do stupid things like write clickbaity fake news just in order to generate some traffic, then there are social considerations there.
Issue which you
well, that's what I'm going to get onto in a
social
sec.
media platforms are a way of exchanging ideas these days, and they're almost replacing newspapers. It's a bit what we used to have
square.
Dozens of newspapers providing contrasting opinions, and now we have one or two big media platforms where people are sort of they're sort of spoon-fed information anyway, aren't they? Which appeals to them based on personal preferences.
Well, there's that algorithmic echo chamber stuff.
And there's just less sort of diversity there.
I mean, the big problem I think that they've got in the States. Not in the States, I think this is globally, but you kind of have to point the finger at the States first and foremost here, is that there's a lack of competence in places like the DOJ and the FCC. These organisations which said, yes, it's okay for you to acquire this company. Now, say for instance, it's like the DOJ, if they had the benefit of hindsight, and they're looking back 15 years now, would they have allowed Google to acquire YouTube? I probably doubt it.
Or Facebook to acquire Instagram or something.
Or would they have allowed Google to acquire Android if they had the benefit of hindsight? I seriously doubt that those acquisitions.
But then we have to remember that Android was absolutely tiny when Google bought
it. I mean, that was just the foresight of Google. They just saw how important mobile was going to be to the search sort of ecosystem,
and the regulators didn't.
They
just didn't get it.
Well, but this arms race with regulators. I mean, the best example of it, if you guys have ever read or seen The Big Short, that the whole way in which that financial bubble was allowed to inflate to such a ridiculous extent was that the smart bankers were miles ahead of the regulators, and there are simple commercial reasons for that. You get paid 10 times more being a banker than the regulator, and so on.
And it's boring, isn't it, being a regulator?
You'd think.
Do you want to go out and start your own company and do something new and exciting, or do you want to regulate other companies?
Yeah, I mean, the cliche is, and I'm sure this is a bit cruel, that you go into regulation if you can't hack it as a banker, or you can't hack it in the industry that you're regulating. I'm sure it's not quite as black and white as that. But, one point, you keep checking the tennis score.
Federer's 2 sets down, for anybody interested in the tennis score.
That's going to be really timely when this comes out on Monday.
And Nadal or Djokovic has won the final.
Anyway, my little tangent of something that interested me this week, and I rather sort of self-indulgently covered, even though it's not necessarily a core telecoms thing, is there was a journalist who felt like he was getting harassed by a YouTuber. And he started tweeting about it and flagging up YouTube, going, what are you going to do about all this harassment? Initially, YouTube went, look, maybe he's being a bit of a dick, but it's not going against our terms and conditions, and basically just get over it. And then there was a big outcry from loads of people going that YouTube handled that badly, and then they bottled it and went, right, okay, in that case we are going to demonetize this YouTuber. And then you got a counter sort of protest from other independent YouTubers who feel like there's basically a culture war or a commercial war going on between establishment sources like big media and big publishers, and then independent producers, which is what stuff like YouTube. Don't get distracted by the box noises. stuff like YouTube is the whole point of YouTube is it enables independent creators like you, any of us. We put this up on YouTube. Anyone, the barrier to entry is zero.
Yeah.
For putting stuff up, and they feel like they're being discriminated against. Anyway, I feel some sympathy for social media companies, of which YouTube's one, because this is essentially a social thing. It just happens to take the form of video, because they're the confluence of all these forces, like establishment producers versus independent producers, regulators versus individuals, and all that sort of thing. Some people are encouraging them to censor more, other people are urging them to censor less. And the reason this is relevant to the regulation thing, in my opinion, is this isn't a call they can make themselves. So YouTube's tied itself in all sorts of knots as to how much it should censor. Because as soon as it doesn't censor one person, it gets accused of basically contributing to bigotry against the people that don't like them and so on.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got a lot of, well, not a lot of sympathy, but I can see how they're painted into such a horrible corner at the moment. Because, someone like Facebook emerged, and the original, the real appeal for people at the beginning was they could put their thoughts in the digital world, and sort of platforms like Twitter and Facebook, and YouTube more recently with video, and this is exactly what you were talking about earlier. They democratized having an opinion and putting the opinion out into the world.
And publishing it.
And now they're getting pinned back a little bit, just as these platforms have to find a way to re-engage the community and say, look, we're still here, we're still offering this amazing service where you can actually broadcast your opinion and you don't have to be part of the media elite to be heard by everyone. They're getting pinned back, which is, I mean, in some cases they're getting quite rightly pinned back and told what to do because they've been irresponsible.
Gone too far.
But in some cases you've got to say, well, the basic promise of social media was people could put their opinion out, irrelevant of what it was, and people would listen. Now if they're getting pinned back too much, is it going to be appealing to people just as they need to reinvigorate that experience?
That's an existential dilemma for them. I think the solution is that regulators or lawmakers come in and say to social media companies they're obliged to not censor unless what is written is illegal. So the only parameters they have to stick to is the law of the land. They don't have to start formulating their own laws. And the thing is, if that was made a regulatory or a legal thing, then when advertisers complain or when activists complain that they haven't censored these people that they don't like, they can just hold their hands up and go, look, it's been taken out of my hands. This is the law.
But then this is the big problem, which is something that was put out by the Advocate General earlier this week, that there's a case in Austria, I think it is, where the leader of the Green Party is accusing, is getting something taken off Facebook because it's defamation, and the EU has turned around and said, well, actually, you might have to apply this European-wide, but they're also telling Facebook you might actually have to remove all of these comments on a global perspective. Now, the law of the land is all well and good, but if you've got the EU saying, you have to apply this throughout your entire platform, that's where there's a bit of a contradiction, because I don't know whether this is true, but my bet would be is that the legal definition of defamation probably varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, what might be defamation in Austria, and Facebook has been told to take it down, it might not be defamation in Japan.
But isn't it possible? I don't know this. Obviously you can. There's sort of, I don't know if geofencing is the right word, but there's ways in which they know which country you're in. Could you not apply policies? They've got all these clever algorithms. Couldn't you apply policies on a country-by-country basis when it comes to that sort of thing?
They do, but then there was this whole right to be forgotten thing last year with Google, where they said, yes, okay, every time someone searches it, and this was down to 2 people had been rehabilitated in prison, so they said to Google, right, we want this removed off your indexes because this is potentially harming
they want to try and get a job and stuff.
Potential employment in the future. And they said, we'll remove it off the indexes where it's relevant, but then the EU turned around and said, no, actually you have to take it off all of the indexes globally because there's a chance that someone would see it elsewhere.
Yeah. It's a bit of a mess, isn't it?
So geofencing is incredibly difficult, but VPNs get around geofencing. So
yes, there's that as well. Yeah, I mean it's a game of whack-a-mole in terms of as soon as you think you solve one problem, another thing comes up. I think that the one thing we can broadly agree on from the start of what you're talking about with the regulation is it's a young industry. No one really knew how the hell it was going to play out, and now everyone's having to play catch up, and you just get the impression that everyone's just winging it. No one really knows what the hell they're doing.
This is the problem, though, and you nailed it. You absolutely nailed it. There is that it's because it's such a young industry.
Yeah.
And because the cogs of the legal world move so slowly, we're still trying to govern digital with analog rules. We're still basing a lot of these decisions on like the Communications Act that was written in the mid-90s or something like that. I mean, I don't know exactly when they were written, but there's still a basis on
you get some that are going way back further than that, when wireless first came out and stuff.
Exactly. And you're looking at these rules are built for fixed.
Yeah.
When the
or actual phones.
Or phone lines, exactly. Phone lines, not mobile. It's
and not mobile internet.
It's fundamentally different.
Okay, we're running out of time. We got one more thing. Jamie, you wrote a little bit about BT scaling back on a lot of its UK operations, but I'm going to throw the ball to Ian first, because I haven't yet. Ian, you've done what looks like, I've only skimmed it, but you've done what looks like a proper bit of number crunching about sort of headcount patterns in the global operator world.
Well, it's something I've been doing
that
for a little while. It's, I think, 3 years now, just sort of tracking trends across. Started off as 20 telcos. They are the 20 biggest by revenue, with headquarters in Western Europe or North America. So it's the AT&Ts, the Verizons, the Vodafones, the Deutsche Telecoms. But it doesn't look at companies like China Mobile or China Telecom, where it's a bit harder to get
presumably
data.
They're quite opaque, yeah.
And obviously some of those companies have operations in other parts of the world, like Vodafone has a lot of staff in Africa, for instance. And the trends, it's now 21 companies, because I added Sprint into the mix just to get a kind of fuller picture of the US. But it's pretty sharply down now. I mean, there's been a lot of news stories this year about headcount reductions at service providers, whether because they're merging operations where they can, where regulation isn't a barrier to them doing that, or whether it's because they're automation's a word we're hearing more and more. It used to be something operators were quite resistant to sort of admitting that they were automating, and they came out with this line that automation actually frees up staff and creates. I mean, a lot of them seem to have given up doing that now. They're kind of, they're pretty.
That's because of people like you,
pretty much coming
you and
forward
us.
and saying, well, it is actually leading to a lot of job cuts.
Yeah.
So the latest round that I did, which I couldn't finish until I think it was either BT or Vodafone came out with its annual report, because some operators obviously report to the end of March, which I've considered as part of the 2018 calendar year for the purposes of this spreadsheet. But the latest data shows headcount's down about 7% since the end of 2015. So it's 127,000 reductions.
This is globally across your 21.
This is across those 21 companies. And not all of them are cutting. There are some that have grown.
But the net is down 15% year on year.
The net's down 7%. So it's the figure at the end of 2015.
Oh, there we go.
If you look at the figure at the end of 2018, it's a 7% reduction.
Okay.
So,
and we might, under normal circumstances, have actually expected some kind of increase, given that.
Yeah, I mean, some of these
revenues,
stuff,
population.
It's not a precise model, because I'm not looking at the whole sector. And there are some instances where, so Telenor, for instance, I think its headcount went down about a third last year.
Right.
Went down from about 30,000 to 20,000.
Wasn't that because a lot of it they ditched
exactly
a lot of business units like India?
So there are instances where they've sold. So the Central and Eastern European operations basically got sold. In the first instance, the employees are going to find themselves working for a different employer. They're not actually losing their jobs, and they also divested a banking business in Pakistan. But they have cut.
Didn't they close down India as well?
Well, that was the year before.
Oh,
they got rid of India. And that would have probably led to reductions, because that was merged. So then you get.
But that's why looking across a broad range of companies is good, because that's a macro trend.
It is, but 2,000. So Telenor's cuts 2,000 did go because of automation, and that's something that they saw last year as well, and they're expecting to see this year. So they're cutting a lot of jobs because of investment.
And when we say automation, there's obviously various business functions that can be automated. Yeah. There's customer service with chatbots and all that sort of thing.
I think that's where most of the impact's been so far.
Right.
But you're increasingly hearing people talking about things like whizzy words, like expressions like intent-based networking, where you basically tell the system what you want it to do.
Yeah,
and whereas
and it works
previously
out
you needed an engineer to kind of do all the sort of nitty-gritty, it just does it itself. So or just basically moving more stuff into the cloud. This is where the internet guys come into it again, because a company like 3, for instance, which used to do a lot of IT and operational stuff in-house, is now handing more and more of it over to Microsoft Azure.
Right.
So they're cutting their whole
Yeah.
technology and operations team by 2/3.
No, there's a part of this isn't that surprising, just on two levels. Firstly, all companies, especially large companies, nearly always get a share price spike when they say they're getting rid of some overhead.
Yeah.
So there's a general public company trend to always be looking to trim overhead. And then there's the fact that operators are, to a large extent, utilities. And utilities often, a primary part of their business model is to improve margin by efficiencies and lowering overheads and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So those aspects of it don't surprise me. But do you think, sort of over and above that, this automation points to a trend that supersedes those things that don't surprise me?
Yeah, I think. I think the reductions that these new technologies are allowing operators to make are kind of unprecedented, really. I mean, you hear people like Dave Dyson at 3 saying we're going to cut the technology and operations team by 2/3 over the next few years. Yeah, and that's a massive reduction. Because,
just let Skynet take over.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And the same. I mean, the customer service assistant side of things, where as the words chatbots, you sort of use a messaging tool or even a voice system to talk to a machine rather than a person. There are not all customer service assistant jobs will go, because there are instances where, certainly at the moment, those chatbots can't answer certain questions, or they get confused, and you do need to refer it back to someone. But it is going to have quite a big impact, I think, on the
and they have sort of escalations, and they try and.
And I think the other issue for these companies is that they're now at a point where they're launching, always talking about 5G. Those networks are, if they do get used to support Internet of Things connectivity and all billions and billions potentially of device connections, we're told, in the next decade, it's just really, really confusing for an operator to. It's really complex. It's really difficult to do that and manage it with a kind of human workforce. They actually need automation to come. And you could argue that, at first there's not necessarily going to be cuts. It's just a case of introducing more complexity, and they don't want to recruit staff to deal with it. They need machines to do it. So there will still be opportunities.
But the broader
there for
trend
people
is
to introduce. But I think the broader trend is towards cutbacks. And I think the other problem with 5G, that there's not really an obvious upside for operators other than cost savings, because it's deemed to be a more efficient technology. It's not that obvious that they're going to be able to grow revenues from new 5G services. They've never really done it before when they've introduced a new generation of technology. And I know there's some hope that some of this low latency stuff we're talking about might give rise to new sales opportunities, but they're under pressure to boost profit margins when they introduce this technology, which is going to cost a lot to build, which makes it even more imperative they kind of look towards automation to try and get rid of staff numbers, because that's one of the biggest overheads they've got, of course.
Yes, no, I think it's hard to argue with, and and the thing that Jamie wrote about that I'll summarise briefly is that BT's scaling, getting rid of about 270 out of 300 office locations in the UK, so it's doing a massive sort of
I saw that.
Geographical consolidation.
So are they actually cutting staff along with that? Or,
they didn't seem to be, unless I've misremembered it, Jamie. It didn't seem to be an explicit headcount statement.
Cuts.
No, there was no sort of like adding in any extra numbers, but I think this is just one step in the consolidation plan and the restructuring that they announced a couple of when was it last May. They announced 13,000 jobs to be cut. They said they were streamlining operations. They need to make more money, and one of their big issues is assets. And they, I got a bit of sympathy with them in that case, because we've just gone through exactly the same process at Informa. Informa has X amount of offices scattered around London, and all of a sudden we've consolidated into one floor
on the
Blue Fin building. So it's a very, very normal business decision to consolidate property like that. But obviously, in the light of what's going in the bigger picture of what's going on at BT, it's that first real step.
Kind of related to those
of this restructuring process, and
it's quite symbolic, isn't it?
It's a lot more painful because there's a lot more negatives associated to it. We're not losing jobs at Informa because we're not in the same position as BT, and BT has to. It's a different spin on why they're doing it.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we pretty much run our course there. How's the tennis going, Ian?
Nadal's 4-1 up in the third,
Oh, it's
so
game over, isn't it?
I think it's pretty much game over.
Okay.
To Pierre's disgust.
On that note, we're going to attempt to go off and have some kind of barbecue or something. I don't think the weather's being too kind. Let's see how it goes. Anyway, Thanks a lot, guys, and thank you very much for listening. Make sure you join us for the next one.